The soft glow of the chandelier above bathed Pastor Dominion's luxurious office in a golden hue. The walls adorned with framed pictures of the man of God, shaking hands with dignitaries, his radiant smile a symbol of his success. The floor, a pristine marble, echoed the sound of Deborah's hesitant steps. She had been dragged here by her mother's insistence, her mother's blind faith that Pastor Dominion held the key to her daughter's future. "You're destined for greatness," Pastor Dominion had said when Deborah first entered the room, his voice smooth, authoritative, dripping with conviction. He had placed his heavy hands on her shoulders, his fingers pressing into her skin with an intensity that made her feel small, insignificant. "But forces beyond your understanding are holding you back. Only I can break these chains for you." Deborah's body stiffened, her mind swirling. Was this truly the divine intervention her mother spoke of? The words hung in the air like a prophecy, heavy and foreboding. Her mother had insisted she attend this special prayer with the man she revered, but nothing about this moment felt holy. She glanced around the room. The gleaming gold accents, the photos, the sense of power that oozed from every corner of the office. It felt more like a shrine to his ego than a sanctuary for the soul. "Step closer," Pastor Dominion commanded, his voice sharp, leaving no room for hesitation. Deborah obeyed, though every instinct in her screamed to run. She felt the tight grip of fear, her heart racing as she walked toward him. With a deliberate motion, he began his prayer. His voice dropped to a low, melodic hum, a stark contrast to the chaos that churned inside her. He spoke of breakthrough and blessings, but Deborah couldn't focus on his words. His grip on her shoulders tightened, and for the first time, she felt something shift in the air, something dark and unfamiliar. His breath now came in slow, controlled waves as his hand slid to the back of her neck, his touch sending an icy chill down her spine. She wanted to scream, wanted to break free, but the weight of his presence pinned her in place. Then, without warning, his demeanor shifted. The warmth in his voice turned to something colder, something more calculated. His hands gripped her tighter, as if attempting to tether her soul to his. His words weren't prayers, they were commands. She was no longer a vessel for God's light, but a pawn in a game she didn't understand. "Trust me," he whispered, his lips brushing the side of her ear. "This is the only way to unlock your potential. Don't resist it." Deborah's heart pounded in her chest as she fought against the overwhelming sense of dread creeping over her. She tried to pull away, but his grip was ironclad. The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with tension. When it was over, and he released her, she felt as though her world had shifted on its axis. The man before her was no longer the charismatic leader who filled the church with worshipers. He was something darker, something more sinister. He adjusted his suit with an air of nonchalance, his face regaining its calm, controlled smile. "Don't say a word to anyone," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "If you do, you will curse yourself and your family. Do you understand?" Deborah's throat tightened, her voice barely a whisper as she nodded numbly, her body trembling. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Pastor Dominion is God's vessel on earth. He is the one who will guide you to your destiny. But now, it felt as though that destiny had been stolen from her, wrapped in the false guise of divine intervention. She turned quickly, escaping his office, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence of the hallway seemed to mock her as she rushed to the front door. She could still feel his presence, like an invisible weight pressing on her chest. She needed to get out, to breathe, to escape. But as the door closed behind her, she felt a sudden and overwhelming sense of isolation. The world outside felt distant, alien. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Her body ached, and she could still feel the imprint of his hands on her shoulders. At home, her mother was busy in the kitchen, humming a tune as she peeled yams for dinner. The smell of spices and simmering stew filled the house, but to Deborah, it only added to the weight of the day. Mrs. Rachel looked up from her cooking, her face glowing with the warmth of the home. "How was the prayer session, Deborah?" she asked casually, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Did Pastor Dominion pray for you? I'm sure he saw great things for your future." Deborah swallowed hard, her throat dry. The words she wanted to say lodged themselves in her chest, refusing to come out. How could she explain what had happened? How could she describe the fear that still gripped her heart, the violation she had experienced? Her mother's unwavering faith seemed to close off any room for doubt. Deborah knew she had to tread carefully. "Mama," she began, her voice trembling. "Something happened. Pastor Dominion. He isn't who you think he is." Mrs. Rachel froze, the knife she held falling onto the cutting board with a sharp clink. Her face darkened, and her tone shifted immediately. "What nonsense are you speaking, Deborah? Do you think you know more than a man of God? A man who has led this congregation for years. You must be careful with your words." Deborah opened her mouth to protest, but her mother raised a hand, silencing her. "Enough. You are a child. You don't know what's good for you. Go to your room and pray for forgiveness. You don't want to bring a curse upon this family." Tears stung Deborah's eyes as she took a step back. The weight of her mother's rejection felt like a physical blow. "But Mama, she started, but the words were swallowed by her mother's sharp command. "Go to your room," Mrs. Rachel shouted, her voice harsh and final. Deborah recoiled, her heart heavy. She turned away, retreating to the quiet sanctuary of her room. As the door clicked shut behind her, she let the tears fall freely. She collapsed onto her bed, her body racked with sobs, the truth of what had happened crashing over her like a wave. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shout at her mother, to tell her the truth. But in this house, truth was a luxury, and silence was its cruel master. Days passed, and Deborah's life became a series of quiet, painful moments. She continued with the motions of her daily routine, but something inside her had shifted. She couldn't escape the feeling that her soul had been stained, marked by the very person her mother had entrusted her to. Pastor Dominion's grip on her was no longer just physical. It was psychological, a constant, haunting presence in her mind. Every prayer session, every sermon she heard from him felt like a mockery. His voice, once a source of comfort, now carried a hidden malice. She began to notice the subtle ways he manipulated the congregation, how he preyed on their hopes, their dreams, their vulnerabilities. But for Deborah, the most suffocating part was the isolation. No one would believe her. Her mother, her friends, even her own reflection. All seemed to be complicit in a silent agreement to ignore the truth. One evening, as Deborah sat at the kitchen table, trying to focus on her homework, she noticed her mother's suspicious glance. Mrs. Rachel had been eyeing her more frequently, as though she sensed something was wrong but was too afraid to confront it. Deborah could feel the growing divide between them, the weight of her unspoken truth pressing down on her like an anvil. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between Deborah and her mother grew. Her heart ached with each passing moment, the gulf between them widening as her mother's trust in Pastor Dominion remained unwavering. Deborah could no longer shake the feeling that she was living a double life, one of outward compliance and quiet suffering. Despite the facade of normalcy at home, Deborah's mind was a storm. She couldn't stop replaying the events in Pastor Dominion's office, the way his touch had made her skin crawl, the cold, authoritative way he had spoken to her. She wondered if anyone else had experienced something similar, if perhaps she was not the only one who had been trapped in his web. But the question lingered in her mind unanswered, because no one had dared speak out. Not a single soul. At school, she tried to focus on her studies, but the words Pastor Dominion had spoken haunted her thoughts. Asterisk, only I can break these chains for you. Asterisk, she had begun to wonder if she truly was destined for greatness, as he had claimed, or if she was just another one of his victims, caught in his manipulation. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling class, Deborah found herself walking through the hallways, aimlessly. Her feet led her toward the familiar, comforting scent of the library. But as she approached the entrance, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the distance. Pastor Dominion's right-hand man, Deacon Samuel. His presence was an odd mixture of power and subservience, and every time Deborah saw him, a wave of unease washed over her. But what stopped her in her tracks that day wasn't just Deacon Samuel. It was the woman standing next to him. A young girl, no older than Deborah herself, was standing there, her eyes wide with fear. She looked as if she had been crying, her body trembling as Deacon Samuel spoke to her in hushed tones. Deborah watched from the corner of her eye, feeling the pull of curiosity and dread. The conversation was brief, but the girl's expression said it all. She was afraid, and her fear was so palpable that Deborah could feel it in her own bones. The girl glanced around, her eyes locking with Deborah's for just a moment before she quickly looked away, retreating into the shadows. There was something in her eyes, something that spoke of secrets and pain, something that felt too familiar. Deborah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She wanted to approach the girl, to ask her what had happened, to find out if she too had been preyed upon by Pastor Dominion. But she couldn't. The fear of being caught, the fear of speaking out and facing the wrath of Pastor Dominion and his followers, kept her rooted to the spot. The girl disappeared into the hall, leaving Deborah standing alone, consumed by a sense of helplessness. Was there more to this than she had originally realized? Were there others, victims like her, who had fallen under the spell of Pastor Dominion? That night, as Deborah sat in her room, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in the house. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She replayed the girl's face over and over in her head, the look of terror in her eyes. Deborah knew deep down that she couldn't let this go. The truth needed to be uncovered. But how? And who could she trust? It was then that the phone rang, breaking her train of thought. She glanced at the caller ID and froze. It was an unknown number, but something urged her to pick it up. Hesitant, she answered, her heart pounding. "Hello," she said, her voice shaky. "Deborah, it's me, Chuka," the voice on the other end whispered. Deborah's breath caught in her throat. Chuka was a former member of Pastor Dominion's congregation, someone who had once looked up to the pastor with unshakable faith. But he had left the church a few months ago under mysterious circumstances, and Deborah hadn't heard from him since. "What's going on, Chuka?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't know how to say this, but you need to be careful." Chuka's voice was low and frantic. "There are things going on in that church, things no one knows about, things I can't explain. Pastor Dominion isn't who he says he is. You're not the first, Deborah. He's been using his position for far more than just spiritual guidance." Deborah's stomach churned. "What do you mean? What's really going on?" There was a long pause before Chuka spoke again, his words coming out in a rush. "I've seen things, Deborah. Women, girls, who come to him for guidance end up broken, lost, and desperate. He claims to be a vessel of God, but it's all a lie. He manipulates them. He uses them. You're not the only one. There are others. I tried to expose him, but it's dangerous. He's powerful, Deborah. He controls everything." Deborah felt as if the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. She wanted to speak, to ask him more, but she couldn't find the words. Chuka continued, his voice trembling with urgency. "You need to get out of there, Deborah. Get out now, before it's too late. I don't know if I can help you, but I know you're in danger." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Deborah sat frozen, staring at the phone in her hand, the realization settling over her like a cold fog. Pastor Dominion had been using his power for years, but she had been blind to it. Chuka had been right. It wasn't just her. There were others. She wasn't the first. Her heart hammered in her chest as a sense of dread swept over her. She couldn't let this continue. But what could she do? Her mother would never believe her. The congregation would never turn against him. She was trapped, caught in a web of lies and manipulation. The following days felt like an eternity. Deborah's thoughts were consumed by the phone call from Chuka. She couldn't stop replaying his words. couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of danger that clung to her like a shadow. She knew she had to act, but fear held her back at every turn. Then, one evening, as she sat at the dinner table with her mother, the unthinkable happened. "Mama," Deborah said, her voice shaking as she tried to keep her emotions in check. "I need to talk to you." Mrs. Rachel looked up from her plate, her expression unreadable. "What is it, Deborah? You've been distant lately. What's on your mind?" Deborah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I need you to listen to me. Pastor Dominion, he's not who you think he is. He's using people. He's hurting people, Mama." Her mother's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "What are you saying? Are you accusing a man of God of such things? You must be out of your mind. Pastor Dominion has done nothing but good for this family. I'm telling you the truth." Deborah's voice cracked with desperation. "You don't see it, but he's manipulating you. He's using you, using all of us." Mrs. Rachel's face darkened, and she stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I won't listen to this nonsense. You've been listening to lies, Deborah. I won't have you dishonor Pastor Dominion like this." Deborah's heart sank as she watched her mother storm out of the room, her words echoing in the silence. She knew it was over. Her mother would never believe her. She was alone, but she couldn't give up. She couldn't let Pastor Dominion continue his reign of terror over the people who trusted him. The tension in the house had reached a boiling point, and Deborah knew that something had to change. The weight of the secret she carried was too much to bear, and the darkness in Pastor Dominion's world was suffocating. It was time to make a decision. Stay in the safety of denial or fight to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Deborah's world felt like it was slowly caving in on her. Her mother's refusal to believe her, Pastor Dominion's power, and the suffocating weight of the truth made her feel like a prisoner in her own life. Each passing day brought new waves of fear and self-doubt. She knew what she had to do, but the cost of exposing Pastor Dominion was unclear. Who would listen? Who would believe her? Her thoughts were interrupted one afternoon as she walked home from school. A group of girls from her class gathered around the gate of her house, whispering to one another. When Deborah approached, they fell silent. It wasn't until she was within earshot that one of them, Titi, spoke up. "Deborah, we need to talk to you," Titi said, her voice low, her eyes darting around nervously. Deborah's heart skipped a beat. "About what?" she asked, though a sinking feeling already told her the answer. Titi exchanged looks with the others before stepping closer. "It's about Pastor Dominion. We know you've been going to him for prayers, and we just want to warn you." Deborah's stomach twisted. "Warn me about what?" Titi glanced around once more before leaning in. "There are more of us, Deborah. We've all been to see him. Some of us have experienced things we can't explain. He makes promises, but they never come true. It's like he's using us. I think he's after something else." Deborah's breath caught in her throat. "You've been to see him too?" Titi nodded. "A lot of us. Some of us are scared to talk, but we can't stay silent anymore." Deborah's mind was reeling. This was it. She wasn't alone. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope, however faint. But she needed more answers, more proof. She couldn't stand idly by while Pastor Dominion's dark influence spread further. "We need to do something about this," Deborah whispered urgently. "But we need to be careful. He has eyes everywhere." Titi's expression hardened. "We know. That's why we have to be smart. We'll keep meeting, Deborah, but we can't do it here. It's too dangerous." Deborah nodded, her mind racing. The thought of standing up against Pastor Dominion terrified her. But now, more than ever, she knew she couldn't let him continue. Too many lives had already been destroyed. She had to stop him, even if it meant losing everything. Over the next few weeks, Deborah and the group of girls began meeting in secret. They would gather in different locations around the neighborhood, anywhere they wouldn't be seen. In hushed tones, they shared their stories, their fears, and their suspicions. They compared notes, each girl recounting her experience with Pastor Dominion, the promises he had made, and the subtle, coercive tactics he used to gain their trust. What they found was chilling. Pastor Dominion had a pattern. He didn't just prey on the vulnerable. He targeted young, impressionable girls, offering them false hope in exchange for their loyalty. Some girls spoke of how he made them feel special, chosen. Others revealed how he would use spiritual jargon to manipulate them into doing things they weren't comfortable with, all under the guise of God's will. Deborah listened, horrified but relieved to know that she wasn't imagining things. There was a system, a pattern to his behavior. It wasn't just her. It was a network of deceit and manipulation. But the more Deborah uncovered, the more she realized how deep Pastor Dominion's influence ran. He controlled everything. The church, the community, even the local authorities. No one would believe them. The idea of going to the police seemed impossible. After all, Pastor Dominion's power wasn't just spiritual. It was political, economic, and deeply entrenched in the fabric of the city. "I can't do this alone," Deborah said one evening, her voice trembling. "We can't fight him unless we expose him to the world." "But how?" TT sat beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll find a way, Deborah. We have to." As the days passed, Deborah grew more desperate. The weight of the secret was suffocating her. And with each new piece of information she uncovered, the reality of what she was up against became more daunting. Pastor Dominion wasn't just a false prophet. He was a predator, a man who used his power to manipulate, control, and harm. He had built an empire on lies, and now that empire was beginning to crack. One evening, after another covert meeting with the girls, Deborah made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to confront him, face to face. But she had to do it carefully. If she went in too boldly, she could be destroyed or worse, discredited. The next morning, Deborah went to church as usual, her heart pounding in her chest. The grand, ornate building loomed before her like a fortress. Pastor Dominion would be there, in the pulpit, preaching about prosperity, about breakthroughs. But this time, it wasn't about blessings. It was about survival. Deborah waited until the service had begun before slipping into the back of the church. Her mother was already seated near the front, her eyes closed in fervent prayer, utterly unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. She stood at the back, observing the sea of people, the unwavering devotion in their eyes. They all believed in him. They all trusted him. And that's what made this moment so terrifying. She was about to shatter everything. But it had to be done. As Pastor Dominion's voice boomed over the speakers, Deborah's eyes locked onto him. He was speaking about divine favor, his words as smooth and enticing as ever. The crowd hung on to every syllable, oblivious to the darkness that lurked behind his carefully crafted image. Deborah took a deep breath. Then slowly, deliberately, she made her way to the front. She knew her actions would draw attention, but she didn't care. She had no choice. It was now or never. The moment Deborah stepped forward, the entire congregation fell silent. The eyes of hundreds of people turned to her, confusion and curiosity written across their faces. Pastor Dominion's expression remained unchanged, his gaze piercing, almost calculating. "Deborah," he said, his voice smooth but with a hint of danger. "What is it that you seek, my child?" Deborah's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to speak. "Pastor Dominion, I know what you've been doing. You've been using people. You've been lying to them, manipulating them, and I won't stand by and let it continue." The silence in the room was deafening. Pastor Dominion's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "My child, you are troubled. I understand, but this is the enemy trying to steal your peace. You need to trust in me." And justice had been served, not with wrath, but with the unwavering strength of a woman who refused to stay silent. Deborah's story wasn't just about exposing a lie. It was about the power of truth, the strength to stand up when the world is watching, and the healing that comes with finding your voice. As the years passed, The city would never forget the young girl who brought down the man who had once been untouchable. Her courage would inspire countless others to speak their truth, no matter the cost. And for Deborah, that was the greatest victory of all. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to my channel, turn on the bell notification button, and comment what you think about the story below. Stay safe and stay blessed.